con lo que no se inquiete nadie, ¿eh? Deben transcurrir unos segundos por razones técnicas. Estamos sobre ello. Veremos si esta publicidad nos gusta.
Es la historia romántica, ¿no?, de unas fotografías que de repente una maleta desaparece, se descubre al cabo de 70 años. Es una historia fantástica, o sea, es que es ficción.
It's like you discovered the Picasso notebooks from the most important period of his work, and all of a sudden the door opens and you can follow Capa around in a kind of virtual reality and see where he went and why he did certain things and the choices that he made. The novel, revolutionary ways he was using visual techniques to communicate a story. It's hard to diminish the importance of these negatives, not only for the history of photography, but for the history of 20th century culture internationally.
La maleta mexicana concentra la memoria más allá, digamos, de las imágenes que tomó Capa. Creo que nosotros en México tenemos la oportunidad, porque forma parte de nuestra historia, de entender eso, de entender lo que está más allá de las imágenes, esa memoria que trasciende lo que sucede detrás y en un negativo, ¿no? Hay una memoria emocional que está en la maleta, que pertenece más a México como un país que abrió sus puertas a esta generación de españoles que vinieron a México.
Justamente este trabajo de Gerda Taro, David Seymour y Robert Capa nos está hablando del deseo de preservar algo en el tiempo, y la ruta que siguió, que es la ruta del exilio, creo que nos habla de lo que fue en buena medida el siglo XX y sus convulsiones. Yo creo que la sensación que se tiene es no encontramos algo, o no solamente encontramos algo, sino he aquí la resurrección de toda una época.
yo estoy aquí porque tengo a mi abuelo ahí en la fosa. Entonces, pues eso, quería conseguir dignificarlo o encontrar el sitio y a poder ser, pues sumarlo. Solo tengo una foto, pero que no es de cuando la guerra, es una foto de cuando hizo la mili. Y luego sí que tengo una foto de cuando se casó con mi abuela, que esa además la pedí yo para mí, y es lo único que tenemos de él, no tenemos más. Él tiene una hermana que todavía vive y es la que me ha contado cosas de él, porque nadie quería hablar en mi familia, nadie contaba nada.
Es imposible dejar a un lado un pedazo de historia. Puede no gustarnos, nos puede doler, nos puede enojar, pero no podemos olvidar lo que pasó y no podemos pretender olvidar.
Every family in Spain has a direct connection, a grandparent, a great-grandparent, who was one way or another involved in the Spanish Civil War. The war today in Spain, 70 years later, is still an open wound, and it awakens astonishing passions from both sides, both from the right and the left.
My grandfather, he's 90 right now. He's never talked to us about the Civil War. And when I was back in Spain last Christmas, I asked him, would you mind talking to me about the Civil War? And he started crying when he started talking of that story. And it was amazing the fact that he's never talked to us about that and how deep the feelings are when he's talking about things that happened 60 years ago.
Es muy típico en España el no saber nada de la guerra civil, pero es verdad que también, como antes decía, esta nueva generación está intentando saber lo que no les han enseñado en la escuela.
Jo he après molt més estant fora de Catalunya, estant fora d'Espanya, he après moltes més coses estant en Mèxic del que sabia a Catalunya. El nostre país no vol que nosaltres sapiguem sobre el nostre passat. Y eso es triste, la verdad.
Y bueno, yo creo que lo que de verdad es importante que nos dicen es lo que de verdad vivía la gente, que eso no se sabe en los libros de historia, eso yo creo que es más de la gente mayor, de la calle.
Las cosas que pasó uno y de los bombardeos y todo eso, lo tienen que saber. Que no fue, mi juventud no fue tan fácil.
Yo a los 15 años ya tenía un fusil asignado a mi nombre y con él pues terminé la guerra. Dormía con el fusil, comía con el fusil me acompañaba a todas las partes.
M'ha quedat un record tan gros que no... Me diuen, l'has d'oblidar perquè no es pot recordar sempre el mateix. Jo no ho podré oblidar fins que em mori. Fins que em mori jo no ho puc oblidar.
Y ahora se dan cuenta que un país no puede prescindir de su historia. Entonces un país tiene que conocer su historia, no puede cortar una historia 20 años y estar en la inopia ese país. Entonces quieren volver a recordar y saber lo que fue esa historia que no conocieron por una serie de circunstancias.
The most important historical event in my life is an event that I haven't lived by direct experience. I'm a direct result of the Spanish Civil War, although I was born 9 years later. It has conditioned my life, has made me who I am. Everything I've done in a way, it's been, somewhat related or conditioned by that fact.
These events occurred 75, 80 years ago. It's not that long ago, and people still feel very passionately about this history. Individuals in Spain have a vested interest in a lot of these images and what they mean to them. It's their history. And so There's a lot of live wires in this Mexican suitcase.
One of Cornell's careers, of course, was known for photography. His second career was ICP. But, you know, really, the dutiful brother that he was, his most ambitious third career was to make his brother, Robert Capa, live for the public today, right? So that at his brother's passing, that his work would always have a meaningful place in, you know, the cultural aesthetic life of the present. And that meant for Cornell doing exhibitions, ultimately building a home, the International Center of Photography, for his brother's work, his work. And then, for me, I felt, well, this will bring it full circle. This will finally complete and close the gap of all the known Bob Capa's work that we can move back to New York.
Cornell was a very determined, committed man, a person who was totally devoted to his brother, to the work of his brother, to the legacy of Robert Capa. And he channeled all his energy and everything he did in life with that in mind.
In the context with Cornell, and my devotion to Cornell, and my life in Magnum, all my life, I've been trying to help Cornell look for the Mexican suitcase. He'd always told me about it, and I searched everywhere.
The negatives were just lost for years. Cornell was attempting to look for them in South America, maybe they were there. There were really essentially no leads.
There was rumor that there was a suitcase somewhere buried in a garden. And Cornell wanted that verified. And I think 5 people went and dug up this garden and never found a suitcase.
Cornell put in this French magazine, I don't know if it was photo, I tried to find it yesterday but I couldn't, saying that there was this suitcase with these photographs and if anybody had any information on this, if they please contact him. This was in '79. We didn't hear from anyone.
One day, Concats and Philblock started speaking about this valise that they were trying to retrieve. And of course, I asked a few questions and they answered, and there was this conversation about this mysterious valise that had disappeared, that, well, they knew of its existence. By then they knew of its existence, but they were having great difficulties retrieving it. They were not able to establish a connection with the person who had this valise in his or her possession.
I'm in Mexico because my mother's from here. All my mother's family is from here, so we have a large family. And just came down and stayed after 1976, after finishing school. Decided to stay. My mother and Grace became very, very close friends. They were like sisters. We visited Grace at her house and she was actually on her deathbed. Grace told her daughter Malu to go to the closet and bring this bag that was in the corner, a yellow bag, plastic bag. And so I'm sitting there with this bag on my lap, and then I can tell it has some boxes inside. So I pull out the first box, which was the one on top. I open the box, and the first thing I see is that it's full of these cardboard sleeves. And then I see that it says Espagne in French, 1938. So I interrupt Grace and I say, these are negatives from the Spanish Civil War. And she kind of ignores, says, just do whatever you want to with them, they're yours. And I said, but I think your father, this is part of your father's legacy, this has something to do with him, and I think your father should be related to this archive. And what was his full name? Because I Pancho to me. And she told me, Francisco Aguilar Gonzalez. So that's how I received the general's lost negatives.
are these photographs of? What's actually there? What does it mean? What new things do these negatives tell us about the work of these three photographers, or how the work was constructed in the first place? What historical information do these negatives contain? The Spanish Civil War was kind of a prelude to World War II. It initiated a lot of the conflicts. It was the leading edge of the war against fascism. And here you see, three intrepid young photographers trying to give their perspective on what it looked like to them to see that conflict on the ground at that moment in 1936.
El fotoperiodista, como lo conocemos hoy, el corresponsal de guerra, estamos acostumbrados a que sea una persona que es fotógrafo, que viaja a un país extranjero a documentar. Pero es en la Guerra Civil Española cuando empieza a suceder eso, cuando viene Gerda, cuando viene Capa y viene Chin, que son extranjeros y vienen a la Guerra Civil Española. Todo es nuevo en ese contexto. Entonces cada uno hace lo que puede y crean un estilo, y sin pretenderlo.
Robert Capa se volvió archifamoso por la frase de si la fotografía no funciona es que no estás suficientemente cerca. Él se caracterizaba por fotografiar con enorme riesgo y producir imágenes con un grado de proximidad y realismo extraordinarios.
This is my favorite picture of Bob. He's such a rogue. I can't think of any other word. A rogue to me is someone who gets away with murder.
Bueno, Capa es una especie de Indiana Jones de la fotografía. Es un hombre sumamente divertido, simpático, que se inventó a sí mismo. Era un chico húngaro de barrio que llegó a encumbrarse como el gran exponente de la fotografía mundial.
Capa and Shim were freelancers, and they really got themselves down to Spain. They were not sent, they didn't go in advance at all, but they felt so strongly that the Spanish Civil War was one that they had to participate in. They had to fight with their cameras, essentially, and make the pictures for the international press to gain support and enthusiasm for fighting fascism.
As soon as in Spain the Civil War broke out, the whole world felt a stake in that struggle. People felt that the outcome of the Spanish Civil War would determine the fate of the rest of the world. And it was really that conviction, the idea that if fascism wins in Spain, it'll conquer the rest of the world. Journalists went because they were sent. Many of them also went because they felt a stake in the struggle. They felt that what was being fought over in Spain was important to them personally because they also had political ideas and they had civic duties.
These images are not Capa's images anymore, or images taken by a foreigner who just comes here, spends some time and goes away. They do, define iconographically a big portion of what the war was.
Remember, these guys believed that photos could change the world. And the remarkable thing is that sometimes they succeeded. The photos they took changed what happened in the world. They had dramatic impact, they were reprinted everywhere. Even in those early days, the impact was often powerful.
The approach to war photography hadn't really existed before Robert Capa. This idea of freelance photographers behind the scenes getting action shots of actual battles, being in the foxholes next to the soldiers, I mean, that's nuts. And that was part of what Robert Capa invented. These pictures were taken kind of on the fly, on the cheap. These photographers were all really young. They were kids, 22, 23, 24. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of support from their publishers, and they were often fast-talking their way behind the lines, working closely with the foot soldiers. So there's a real kind of guerrilla action in the way that they actually took the photographs.
It's just where they were, right along the front lines. That's where the story was, that's where they knew would get the picture, that's what the magazines wanted to publish.
People said at the time that Gerda Taro was a little bit crazy because she would run across the battle while people were shooting in order to get a better picture. And this was unheard of prior to this moment. I mean, if you look at the history of war photography, it's really photographs of before the battle or after the battle, but not during the battle.
Verdaderamente las fotos te aportan historia, una historia pero a ras de suelo, ¿no? La que vive el hombre que está en combate con el corazón a 1000 latidos por segundo, pensando quizá en todo lo que deja atrás, si ese día va a sobrevivir, si ese día va a ser el último. Me fascinaron las fotografías de Gerda Taro porque llegan en el fondo a lo más profundo de este episodio, como a lo más profundo de toda la guerra.
There's so much sense of fragmentation. You capture so little of all that's going on. I mean, it's not just the nature of the photograph or even the filmic experience. It's so little of all. There's so many layers of what lies behind any moment that you might capture. How do you speak to injustice? How do you document the conditions? How do you... I mean, the difficulty in a situation like that is even understanding the nature of the tensions. You know, you're an outsider. How do you become sensitized to the subtleties of what's going on as well as the big picture? You know, it's a very simple construct, the people against the dictatorship. But operating within that, it's not just an ideological position that one has. You try to understand the forces at play.
The use of these images from the Spanish War was amazingly important because it was the images many times that translated the whole conflict into very simple terms.
Eso de tener que correr continuamente porque los bombardeos eran 2 y 3 veces, aquello fue uno de los crímenes que uno tiene de recuerdo. O sea, a mí no me lo contaron, yo lo viví, aunque era muy pequeño y no se me puede olvidar. Son cosas que han quedado para siempre en la mente, sobre todo de un niño, como en ese momento era yo.
Muchos perdieron los hijos y fue muy triste, muy triste. Jo sempre darrere les faldilles de la meva mare, sempre espavorida, sempre anava amb molta por, sempre por, sempre tenia por.
One of the things that made the Spanish Civil War so shocking to the Western public was the fact that it was photographed and filmed so much. But what was photographed and filmed was not just the battle action, but the effect of the war on the civilian population, on men, old women, mothers, children, people living in cities going about their lives. The Spanish Civil War was the first large war in Europe that explicitly targeted civilians as legitimate targets of war. If you think about World War I, millions of people died, but they were all soldiers. Here in Spain, regular civilians were dying all the time because cities were being bombed. This was the first time that large-scale city bombing occurred in a war in Europe. So for an American housewife in Columbus, Ohio, to open up Life magazine and see photos of children that are being dragged out of a house that has collapsed because a bomb has fallen on it in Madrid or in Barcelona, it is incredibly shocking.
¿Ves cómo las fotos te cuentan muchas cosas? Te cuentan la metodología de trabajo de ella y Capa.
You're in the right place, you have a sense of what it is that you're seeing, but most of the time you're lost, it's a fog. If you work in the way that I'm referring to, which is really a kind of reportage, you're capturing, you're not constructing, so you're having to move in relationship to all these spatial elements. And I say elements almost because it feels like that. You have to anticipate, and so often you're not in the right place. You're missing something, and you're not asking for it to be replayed. There is no replay button. You know, for me, that's the blur of that contact sheet is a kind of, is very close to what it feels like to be someplace, which you don't know what you're fixing on. You're moving through a space trying to see what, first of all, there's the interaction of moments of things moving. You have to anticipate. You do capture, you don't capture, and most of it is a record of what you miss. And then every once in a while, it comes together.
The personality and the spirit of Gerda Taro, I think a lot of them come through in the many, many portraits that we have of her, where you see this real kind of humor and liveliness and energy.
Gerda was so independent. She was not a woman giving up everything for a man.
I think a challenge for anyone working with Taro's work is how do you deal in a rigorous and serious way with the fact that these two photographers' careers were incredibly intertwined, and it's utterly artificial to separate them out and to pretend that that didn't happen. You know, all of those things are certainly true, but at the same time, I think she's more than just that.
When she came to me, she was completely wrapped in dressings and bandages.